Hi, welcome to the Learning Loop podcast. My name is Chris Ridding. I'm a postdoc in computer science at University of Washington, and Learning Loop is a show devoted to improving your life, your sense of meaning, your relationships, your productivity, etc., all by tackling the problem of forgetting. Why would we do that through tackling the problem of forgetting? Well, I believe that you are the person who's best equipped to solve your own problems and to answer your own questions. You're the person who has access to your values internally, your subjective experience, what feels like it matters, what feels like it doesn't. You have control over whether you spend a lot of time or a little time on those questions, over what approaches to take to solving those questions and problems. But even though you're best equipped to solve those problems, you oftentimes will forget what you once knew that you could use to solve those problems and to answer those questions. And so, my approach to help you stop forgetting those things that you don't want to forget is to help you iteratively learn by going through this loop of taking, organizing, and using your notes to remember what you need to remember and to stop forgetting what you wish you hadn't. As I explore these topics on this show, pay attention to the thoughts that come to your mind of what you could do more of, less of, what you need to implement, what you can ignore, and then put these things into practice and test them out. So every episode, I talk about a specific problem and a specific solution that Learning Loop provides. And the problem that we're going to be talking about today is that of closing the loop on notes that you write, not just by writing those notes, but by writing the meaning, action items, context, and other important properties of those thoughts, realizations, connections. So let's say that you buy into Learning Loop. This is a graphical depiction of the phenomenon that I argued takes place in the first episode. And I've called this figure natural thought because I think it describes basically what happens in our brains organically without Learning Loop. So basically you see this brain. That's your brain. It's a beautiful brain. And in your brain, you have some questions sometimes. And you also have some problems sometimes. And you have other things like questions and problems. And you also have a different sort of thing, which is thoughts, and you have epiphanies, and you make connections, and you read things in podcasts. Well, you read things in books, and you listen to things in podcasts. And there is this sense in which a thought often answers a question, or an epiphany solves a problem. And that's why I've drawn these arrows going between the thoughts and the questions, because you have a question, you have a thought. You have a problem, you have an epiphany. And we have this loop kind of going around and around and around and around. But you get this kind of loss, like you might call it thought transfer or something, like heat transfer in thermodynamics, where there's inherent inefficiencies to the process. And a lot of these thoughts get lost and they float outside of the brain and you forget them. Or a lot of the questions that you have or the problems that you face kind of get ignored for long enough that you lose track of them too. So these arrows represent the forgetting that I talked about in my intro. And ordinarily, you just kind of solve problems by going around and around and around and around here. So contrast that with this. Contrast that with Learning Loop. With Learning Loop, you have basically the same phenomenon, but you introduce a set of notes where you write down some of these thoughts and you write down some of these questions. And it helps you to stop forgetting a lot of the thoughts and the questions that you otherwise do forget. And you can keep track of the things that matter most to you. And you can keep track of the thoughts that are most salient to you. And that's why we see this notepad down here. And we see arrows going down where you have a thought and you write it down. And maybe you use your notes to answer a question. Or you write down a really important question in your notes. And then you can read those notes and have thoughts out the other side. So we have this expansion of the natural thought process to allow us to take notes on our thoughts and epiphanies and connections and our questions and our problems, and then organize those thoughts into notes, and then use those notes to solve our problems, to answer our questions. And that, in a nutshell, is Learning Loop. So back to the problem that we're talking about today. So let's say that you buy into Learning Loop, you're signed up, you're taking notes, and you write down this afternoon a thought that feels really interesting to you now because you understand subconsciously what it means. The problem is, well, that thought, like your normal thoughts, can also get lost. Like if you jot down a note and then you never look at the note again, and you never use it to solve a problem or to answer a question, then it's unlikely that you will ever remember that thing that you jotted down, especially if you write many things down or you have many thoughts. So we need to close the loop on that thought. It cannot help us solve a problem if we forget it. And it's way more likely that we forget it if we write it down just one time and never visit it again. So you need to maximize the odds that you will see it again when you need to see it. And that's going to be solved by this process of closing the loop on that note or closing the loop on that thought. Because as you're writing these thoughts down, you might not organize these notes as you write them, because that would be hard to stop whatever you're doing. Maybe you're driving, maybe you're in a lecture, maybe you're having a conversation and you're jotting down notes, important, salient little thoughts that you think you want to write down to revisit later. I talked about this in episode 1 about how you should have a time that you set aside every single day to organize your thoughts. And closing the loop is a great way to approach organizing these thoughts. And so the problem that we're addressing today is that if you write down a thought, you might never visit it again. You might not know where to put it. You might be looking at this thought and saying in your time of organizing your notes at night, if you do that, so what? What does this thought matter? Where should I see it again? So here's an example of a thing that I said yesterday that I thought was really, really interesting. It's highlighted here in yellow, and I said, saying something over and over again doesn't make you think it. Actually think it. It's going through the motions. How to break out of going through the motions. So, not the most artistic phrasing, not the most eloquent I've ever been, I'll admit. But basically, I think what I was trying to get at is something useful. And so what I should do is I should close the loop on this thought so that A, it's actually clear what I'm saying, B, its implications, its action items, its context is kind of clear, and C, it's in a place where I will in the future actually be able to find it when it's useful. Because without these things, I face the so what problem. What does this mean? What am I going to do with it? Where am I ever going to find this again? You know, there's problems for accessibility, which is like, where do you put it? Or problems for an action, which is like, what do you do? And if I want to make sure that I do what in the moment was clear to me this implied that I should do, that actually happens. And so in order to do that, I'm going to close the loop on this thought. So I'm going to first clarify what I was talking about. I think I was saying something like, simply reciting a thought won't make you feel, understand, comprehend it. Instead, something else is needed. You need to do something to load it into your brain, so to speak. Maybe that involves acting on it. Maybe that involves expanding on it, etc. So now, it's a little bit more clear, I think, what I meant when I said that. And I was in a context where I realized this truth. So maybe this has some sort of implication for note-taking generally. That I need to include prompts for me to engage with a thought that I write down in a dynamic way. Or maybe this has implications for my principles, where instead of just reciting a principle as I used to do, I had them all memorized every single day. Maybe instead what I should do is principles should be practiced instead of simply recited. Maybe that means that, on my notes page I have a how-to, and I include this block in my how-to section that says write them so you can engage with them dynamically. And then I include this block that I linked to that I just barely wrote out. And so now when I take notes and I'm wondering how to do that well, I go to this notes page, I consult the how-to section, and one of the instructions that I have is write them so you can engage with them dynamically. And I can also visit the principles page where I can add a how-to section and I can say practice them dynamically instead of simply reciting them. And I can link to this note that I wrote down on the subject. So here, arguably I've closed the loop on this note because I talked about what kinds of problems that I usually solve or what kind of questions I usually face, that this can help me solve better if I had access to this information in the future. That was all kind of done on the fly though, and I don't feel super confident that I closed the loop on those notes super well, but I was looking through my notes and I found this example of a situation where I feel like I did close the loop on my notes well. So I wrote this thing, I feel so different, so brilliant, it might be because I'm thinking well, out in the woods, etc., but maybe it's because of the caffeine. Am I so different from people going to Burning Man, getting high, getting their minds blown, and feeling brilliant? So that was the original thought. And then I wrote down kind of that this has to do with the subject of caffeine, and it suggests a potential pro for caffeine, which is feeling different and brilliant. And it also suggests a potential con for caffeine, which is if I think psychedelics and other drugs are wrong, and that one should seek joy through more natural, more wholesome, less risky, less addictive, more/less, etc. means, then I shouldn't drink caffeine. And so I went to caffeine, and it's now included under the reasons that I like caffeine. The pros list has this more ideas and energy item, and under its justifications, I now have this whole thing that I just wrote, this note that I just closed the loop on, and I also included it in the over dependence and addiction item in the cons list, in the cons section of my caffeine page. And so I also wrote about how caffeine should, this question kind of raises a point about why I should be humble, because this is a good example of an argument that I should not think myself so different, much better or much worse than others, because maybe this is an example of moral inconsistency on my own part. So then I go to the humility page and I add it to examples from my own life of why I should be humble or where I was rewarded by being humble. So this one thought is useful in various different places, both as pros for caffeine, cons for caffeine, and an example of humility from my own life. And now, when I ask the question, why should I be humble? Or when I ask the question, why should I drink caffeine? Or why shouldn't I drink caffeine? Those are 3 entry points into my notes, 3 different questions and 3 different problems that I'm going to go into my notes and find solutions for according to my old thoughts that I closed the loop on. Here's another example of a thought that I think I failed to close the loop on. The great irony is that massively transformative technologies tend to do all their transforming without its users noticing or even really being happier. So, maybe what I want to do is I want to tweet about this later. And so I'm going to add it to a Twitter tag. And whereas if I wanted to find tweets ordinarily, I could read through every note that I'd ever written and ask myself, what's a good tweet? Or when I happen to write something that's interesting to tweet about, I can tag that note with the Twitter thing so that in the future, when I need candidate tweets, I'll know where to find them, because I have learned through experience that what I do with this Twitter tag is tag candidate tweets. In essence, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get rid of this thought transfer loss, and you're trying to close the loop by writing down the thoughts that matter and using those notes to solve your questions. And then when that works, have your questions be answered. And when it doesn't work, have that inform the way that you take notes in the future, and have those notes clearly dictate which problems you're working on and which questions matter to you, so that when you have this thought or epiphany, you can know what to write down and where to store it. And that way we have this loop going from your brain to your notes, to your brain to your notes, from your brain to your notes, to your brain to your notes, to your brain. Over the course of much time, you can perfect this process so that you are losing as little of these valuable insights as possible. So that's an example where I closed the loop on my own notes well, or, more or less well, in some cases better than others. And I was rewarded by it, and I was glad. And it occurs to me that I should probably talk about how another person could do this and not just me. So my friend told me the other day, for example, I just feel so strongly that anyone could do a startup. And my thought was, imagine if he'd written that down. That could either be, at its most meaningless, totally nothing burger, meaningless bit of fluff, triviality that means nothing to anybody, and it just totally gets lost. Or, at its best, it could be an incredibly empowering thought that takes him through all sorts of storms in his life and helps him to do his dream job, his career that he was called to do, because he keeps returning to it. And when he feels unqualified to do startups, 5 years into his startup journey, 10 years into his startup journey, if he reads that thought over and over again, I just feel so strongly that anyone could do a startup. Like, that could really, really help him to continue on a path in a virtuous way, in a diligent way, and endure and persist. And so the way that I would close the loop on that thought is, first of all, explain why. You might just write, I just feel so strongly that anyone could do a startup. And to you, who's really, really discouraged by startups, that's not going to be very compelling. But if you write that at that point in your life, you met a whole sequence of billionaire founders and they were total idiots, and you were like, wow, anybody could do this, then that's a bit of evidence that might be compelling to a person 5 years down a startup journey that doesn't think that they, a relatively smart person, could do a startup. Or maybe you realize that all startups need to do is to succeed at selling some product to a person, in which case, that's an argument that basically everybody sells things and sells ideas, sells themselves, sells products. And so why couldn't you do a startup if you are going to be selling things in any job that you do anyways? Or maybe you had wrong ideas about the specific kinds of people who are qualified to be founders, and then you realize that there's a ton of heterogeneity in founders, and maybe you realize this over the course of reading many books and listening to many interviews. So if you write that down and you write down the reason, it's going to be a lot more compelling than that thought without the reason or without the argument. So then I would put it somewhere that I could access it. So like I have this overcome page where if I feel doubt, I always write my thoughts that have to do with doubt into the doubt section of my overcome page. And so I would put it there. And then next time I doubt myself in an endeavor, maybe while trying to do a startup, I would try to find the notes that I wrote to myself for that moment by looking where it makes sense to look. So I've built up a connection with the overcome page, so that's where I'm going first. But for somebody else, it might be, the growth mindset page. Or for somebody else, it might be the faith page. Or for somebody else, it might be the motivation page. The whole idea is that you should take notes in a way that works for you. You should organize them in a way that works for you, and you should use them in a way that works for you. And at any point that process breaks down and you don't get out of it what you're looking for, that is getting thoughts and connections connected, getting thoughts and questions connected so that the thoughts can actually answer the questions, or so that the epiphanies can actually solve the problems, then if that's not happening, then something needs to change about your notes. Maybe you need to have fewer pages. Maybe you need to work better on making connections that make sense to you. Maybe you need to work on clarifying your notes so that the person that needs to read it reads it and it's accessible to them, instead of it being inaccessible to them and only accessible to the person that wrote the notes. This is all like an exercise in communication, in clarification, in streamlining, in making this process of coming up with a problem and a question and finding answers in your notes more efficient. And in general, what you want to do is you want to clarify the salient thought, its meaning, its context, its implied actions. Then you want to organize that thought, placing it in a place where you can find it in the future, connect it to the places where you've gone in your notes before to get support. And then you want to, at some point, use that material to make a decision, to solve a problem, to answer a question. And by doing this, you can close the loop and engage in learning loop. And by doing this, you're complying with the learning loop philosophy. So try it out, give it a whirl, iterate on your system, and see what works. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.